"Ma'am, if you don't open that door right now, I'm breaking it down." Sarah Holloway heard the words through the thick fog of fever and pain, her ears ringing as if the world itself were fading away. Her arms were wrapped weakly around her two children as they huddled on the narrow bed, their small bodies trembling not just from the winter cold but from hunger that had eaten into them for days. Emily's face was pale, Jacob's lips were cracked, and Sarah knew that if help didn't come soon, she might not live long enough to save them. Outside, the Wyoming wind screamed across the wooden walls like a warning from God, rattling the door just as hard as the man who stood there demanding money she didn't have. Buck Harlan's voice was sharp, cruel, and final, and every word he spoke felt like a nail being driven into her chest. Sarah tried to speak, tried to beg, but nothing came out except a broken cough as her vision blurred and her heart raced in fear. Then, just as the latch began to move, another voice cut through the storm, low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who was not afraid of men like Buck. "Step away from the door." In that single moment, everything changed. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this aren't just about survival, they're about the quiet courage that changes lives when no one else is watching. What happened next would not only save a sick mother and her starving children, it would shake an entire town that had forgotten what kindness meant. The small cabin smelled of sickness, cold, and dying firewood as Sarah Holloway lay on the narrow bed, her body weak and burning at the same time, her chest tightening with every breath, as if something invisible were slowly squeezing the life out of her. Fever had taken her strength, and she hadn't stood up in days, not since the coughing had grown so violent it left her dizzy and gasping for air. Her dark hair was damp against her pale skin, and her eyes, once full of warmth, were now heavy with exhaustion and quiet fear. On the floor beside the bed, her children sat close together, trying to be brave even though their stomachs ached and their lips were dry from not eating. Emily, only 6, wrapped her thin arms around Jacob, who was barely 4, as if she could protect him from the cold and the hunger just by holding him tight. "Mama, are you going to get up soon?" Emily asked softly, her voice trembling as she reached for Sarah's hand. Sarah forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and whispered that she would, though deep inside she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. Their pantry was empty, the shelves bare except for a small bag of salt and one stale biscuit she had been saving for Jacob, and the last of their money had already gone to the town doctor who had barely looked at her before telling her to rest and drink broth she didn't have. Red Creek was only 2 miles away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world because since her husband died in a ranch accident, the town had stopped seeing her as a neighbor and started seeing her as a burden. She had tried to survive on her own, washing clothes, cleaning houses, even working in the fields until her body finally gave out, and now sickness had taken away the last of her strength, just when her children needed her most. A sudden knock at the door made Emily jump, and Sarah's heart pounded painfully as she recognized the sound, knowing it could only be Buck Harlan, the store owner who had once let her buy food on credit until he decided she was no longer worth waiting for. His fist slammed against the wood as he shouted her name, demanding she open up, his words filled with impatience and anger, and Sarah tried to answer but could only manage a weak cough as Emily whispered that she was scared. Buck threatened to take what was his if she didn't pay, and just as he began to force the door, another voice broke through the cold air outside, calm and firm, telling him to step away. Buck turned, surprised to see a lone cowboy sitting tall on a weathered horse, his long coat dusted with snow, a rifle resting easily on his saddle, and eyes that held a quiet strength that made even a bully hesitate. When Buck sneered that it wasn't his business, the cowboy replied that it was when a man threatened a sick woman and her children. And in that tense silence, something shifted, because for the first time in weeks, Sarah Holloway felt the smallest spark of hope begin to glow inside her broken, exhausted heart. The cowboy dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the frozen snow as if he were stepping into something far more serious than a simple argument. And Buck Harlan suddenly realized that this was not a drifter he could intimidate with loud words or threats. The man's eyes were steady, not angry, just firm in a way that came from knowing exactly who he was, and that kind of confidence made Buck hesitate even though he would never admit it. "You got no claim here," Buck muttered, but his voice lacked the sharpness it had moments before. The cowboy tilted his head slightly, studying him as though measuring the truth behind his words, and then said quietly that hunger and sickness didn't care about debts, and neither did he. Buck spat into the snow, cursing, and finally backed away, not because he had suddenly found compassion, but because something in the cowboy's presence warned him that pushing further would bring consequences he wasn't ready to face. As Buck stomped off toward town, the cowboy turned to the door, knocked gently this time, and waited until Emily slowly opened it, her eyes wide with fear and curiosity as she stared at the tall stranger standing in the cold. When Sarah saw him through the cracked doorway, she tried to sit up but failed, and the look of shame on her face was harder for him to witness than any wound he had ever seen on a battlefield. He introduced himself simply as Eli, asked if she needed help, and without waiting for an answer, stepped inside and took in the empty shelves, the thin blankets, and the fragile children trying not to cry. Years of riding across harsh lands had taught him that suffering often hid behind closed doors, and he had learned that real strength wasn't about carrying a gun, but about carrying responsibility when others couldn't. Eli built up the fire, warmed water, and used what little he had in his saddlebags to make a simple soup, teaching Emily how to stir it slowly and carefully so it wouldn't spill, explaining that even small acts of patience could turn something scarce into something nourishing. As Sarah sipped the warm broth, her shaking eased just enough for her to breathe without pain, and tears slid down her cheeks not from sadness but from the overwhelming feeling of being seen after weeks of being invisible. Eli told her that he had once lost his own family because he had been too busy chasing work and money to notice what really mattered, and that regret was a heavier burden than any saddle he had ever worn. He explained gently to the children that kindness, when shared, had a way of multiplying, and that even when people were cruel like Buck, they were often just afraid of losing what little power they thought they had. By the time night fell, the cabin was warmer, the children had eaten, and Sarah felt just a little stronger. But more importantly, she felt that she wasn't alone anymore, and that knowledge carried a lesson greater than any hardship, that even in a world filled with cold and greed, one person choosing to care could change the fate of many. By morning the snow had softened into a quiet white blanket over the prairie, and though Sarah was still weak, the color had returned slightly to her face, enough for her to sit up and watch as Eli helped Emily and Jacob gather small sticks for the fire, turning even that simple task into a lesson about working together and respecting the little things that keep people alive. He told them that survival was not just about being strong, but about being thoughtful, about knowing when to push forward and when to protect those who were slower or hurting, and the children listened with wide eyes because no one had ever spoken to them like that before. Sarah, resting against a pillow, realized that for the first time since her husband's death, she was seeing a future that didn't end in despair, and it made her heart ache with both gratitude and fear, because hope can be just as frightening as it is beautiful. When Buck returned later that day with 2 men from town, his face twisted with anger and wounded pride, Eli met them outside, not with violence but with calm truth, explaining that a society that crushed its weakest members was already broken, even if it pretended to be strong. Some of the men scoffed, but one of them, an older rancher who had once been helped by Sarah's husband, lowered his eyes in shame and admitted that they had all forgotten what it meant to be neighbors instead of judges. Eli didn't threaten them. He simply reminded them that character is revealed in how we treat people when they have nothing to offer us in return, and those words landed heavier than any bullet ever could. Buck stormed away, but the seed of doubt had been planted in the others, and by evening a sack of flour, a jar of beans, and a bundle of firewood appeared quietly outside Sarah's door, left by hands that were finally remembering their humanity. Inside, Sarah wept not because she was weak, but because she had learned that asking for help was not a failure, and Eli told her that pride had ruined more lives than poverty ever had. As the children ate their first proper meal in weeks, Sarah understood a lesson that would stay with her forever. That resilience is not about suffering in silence, but about allowing kindness to flow through us, because when we let others carry part of our burden, we make room for healing to begin. The days that followed brought a slow but steady change not just in Sarah's strength, but in the heart of Red Creek itself, because when people witnessed how close they had come to losing a mother and 2 innocent children, something inside them began to shift in ways no law or threat ever could. Eli stayed long enough to make sure Sarah could walk again, teaching Emily and Jacob how to tend the fire and store food wisely, and reminding them that responsibility and gratitude grow stronger when practiced every day, not just in moments of crisis. Buck never apologized, but he stopped harassing widows, and even that small change proved that sometimes doing less harm is the first step toward doing more good. When Sarah finally stood outside her cabin without needing support, she realized that sickness had taken much from her body, but it had also revealed the true wealth of community, which is not measured in money, but in how willingly people stand up for one another. Eli prepared to leave, knowing that his purpose was never to stay forever, but to awaken something that others could carry forward, and as he mounted his horse, Sarah thanked him not just for saving their lives, but for teaching them that dignity is something no hardship can steal, unless we allow it to. He told her that the greatest lesson he had learned on the long, lonely roads was that when we choose compassion over fear, we don't just rescue others, we rescue ourselves from becoming the kind of people we would never want our children to grow into. As he rode away into the wide-open land, Sarah held her children close, feeling stronger not because everything was perfect, but because she now knew that even in the harshest world, there will always be someone willing to step forward and say that suffering is not something we have to face alone, and that belief, more than any food or fire, is what truly keeps a family alive. If this story touched your heart even a little, take a moment to subscribe, because every story on this channel is meant to remind us that kindness, courage, and human dignity still matter in a world that too often forgets them. And by subscribing, you help keep these meaningful stories alive for others who might need them just as much as Sarah and her children did. The true power in life is not wealth, strength, or authority, but compassion. Because when we choose to stand up for those who are weak, sick, or forgotten, we don't just change their future, we change our own, proving that even one caring person can turn despair into hope and remind an entire world what it means to be human.